Welcome to this morning's session on ESG issues, which is focused on your roles as in-house counsel and talks about some of the considerations and that you may want to be taking into account. For those of you who don't know me, I think most of the participants do. I'm Jayne Hussey. I'm a partner in Mills & Reeve. My day job is supply chain contracting, but I also lead our in-house in focus programme. This morning, I am delighted that I'm joined by Carla Parsons, who's part of our ESG team, and Neil Pearson, who heads up our ESG team. Neil's title is Head of ESG and Social Value. And they're going to be taking us through the issues. They're going to speak for around about 30 minutes and leave 15 minutes for questions. On the subject of questions, if you hover at the bottom of the screen, you will see the Q&A function. Please pop your questions in there. You will appear as anonymous to the other participants, but not to us as panelists. So you can mark yourself as anonymous, but if you leave your name in there, it means that if we don't get to your question during today's session, we can always follow up with you afterwards. We will be recording this session and we will be circulating the slides and the recordings to you in a few days' time. And then final point on housekeeping, as it were, is feedback. Your feedback is really important to us. So as the session closes this morning, a feedback slide will come up. If you could please populate that with your feedback on today's session, but most importantly, your suggested topics for the future, because we use your suggestions to shape our programme going forward. And we're forward planning at the moment for the after Christmas in-house in focus sessions. So prior to handing over to Neil and Carla, we thought we would run a quick poll. So if you could answer this poll for us, this you will see is really a question around how you rate your organisation's progress on its ESG journey. And firstly, what does ESG mean? Second, option 2 is we're starting to talk about it. Third, we've made some progress. Fourth, we've made a good amount of progress. And 5, we're all over it. So we will give this just a few seconds for you to complete your answers, and then I will be handing over to Neil. Okay, that's great. I can see most of you have answered. Neil, let me hand over to you and I'll let you pass some observations on the results of the poll.
Thanks, Jayne. Good morning, everybody. Yes, it looks like about 50% either haven't started at all or are just in the process of discussing it internally before they can figure out what to do, which is good news for us because we've kind of pitched it at people who are early on in the journey. And another 30% odd who made some progress, which I think is probably a fairly typical cross-section of what we see when we talk to clients and other organizations that we work or collaborate with. So I think we're all in this boat, and for me, ESG is one of those issues where it's a little bit unusual for lawyers talking to other organisations about this, because normally we're talking to you about developments in the law that affect you or your sector or your size of organisation. In this case, we as a business, we employ 1,200 people, we have 6 offices, we're affected by ESG in the same way that you as a business are. So we also are in the starting to discuss it / making some progress bucket. So okay, so that's really interesting to hear. Thank you very much for that. If we can crack on. I'm going to start off just by a kind of a basic reminder. So if we could move on to the first slide, please, around what is ESG. I don't know, Kate, if you could move the slides on. Thank you. Right, ESG. Yeah, so what does it stand for? Well, I was, before I took on this this role of ESG, a tax lawyer, and tax lawyers, more than just about any other kind of lawyers, love 3-letter acronyms. So ESG is a perfect career choice for me. So what does it mean? Well, the E stands for environmental. We're talking here about preservation of the natural world, the impact that our organisations have on it and natural resources. S is social. That looks at all aspects around the people. That's people who work within our organisations and also the communities that we operate in and serve. And then the G is governance, which really looks at the way in which we run organisations and take decisions. So that's great. It's a really nice shorthand way of covering some pretty wide and sweeping areas. But what does it actually mean? Well, for me, I kind of describe it as a way in which organisations themselves aim to become more responsible citizens. As individuals, in our private lives, we may take the view that we do adopt some of these things and we become responsible in terms of the way in which we treat the environment and people. But organisations themselves are citizens and make big impacts on the environmental and the social. ESG in some ways is difficult to encapsulate because it means different things to different people. And we see that when we look at standards for benchmarking ESG progress. There is no standard definition. There is no standard benchmark. We're hopefully moving in a general direction where there is more consensus as to what it means. But ESG is really gaining traction because there is a growing recognition that no organisation can be sustainable in the long term if its activities come at too great a cost to society. And by sustainable here, we're not just talking about environmental sustainability. We're talking about the long-term sustainability of your organisation. If you're a business, is your business going to survive if you don't adapt to this world? If you're a not-profit organisation, well, will you be able to get funding? Is your organisation not going to carry on because of the direction of travel of ESG? So I think it's probably fair to say that ESG is no longer a nice to have and is being regarded more and more widely as a key to long-term sustainability. So if we could just have a look at the next slide. I just thought I would run through, Kate, if you could just move on. Each of these headings cover a lot of areas, and I suspect you as in-house counsel, what are the first ports of call when an organisation decides for the first time it's going to develop an ESG strategy and is going to implement it? More often than not, that's going to end up on your desk. So if we look at the kind of areas that we cover under the E and the S and the G, well, the environment is probably, especially in the light of COP26 and all the publicity that's getting at the moment, the easiest one to get a grasp on. So we look at CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. What does your business produce in its own activities? But it's much wider than that. You would be looking at water use and management, waste management. Does your business have any impact on deforestation, which is a huge issue, and pollution? If you're a manufacturing business, well, what do you do? Are you polluting or not? Okay, next slide. Thanks, Kate. And then on the social, well, again, sounds self-evident, but what does it actually cover? Well, employee diversity and inclusion and social mobility is becoming a key area for a lot of employers. Human rights, the impact that your organisation has and the people that you deal with. Fair employment practices and pay, again, been a big issue. There's been some very high-profile cases of organisations not employing fair practices and getting some pretty bad publicity as a result. Harassment and bullying, we're seeing that in certain sectors, particularly data security and privacy. Absolutely key issue around protecting people's privacy, and also the contributions that organisations make to the communities that they operate in and serve. Okay, thanks, Kate. Next slide. And then the governance. A lot of people that I certainly talk to around ESG, this is the one that sometimes they struggle with the most. But for me, it's about how you make the right decisions and how you make sure you have the systems in place to make the right decisions and take the right things into account. So we look at the board structure and its diversity. We look at the ethics policies, anti-bribery and corruption. Whistleblowing in particular is a really key one if you want transparency in your organisation. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of some of the kinds of things you'd be looking at if ESG lands on your desk and you're looking at starting the journey. So with that, I will hand on to Carla, who's going to look at what are the drivers for change in the world of ESG.
Thank you very much, Neil. So Neil has obviously given you a great oversight into what is ESG. And if you are in the group of you that said we're very much at the early stages of this journey, we're just starting this discussion, probably hearing some of that, you've gone, actually, this is nothing new. We've been looking at some of these issues for a really long time. But why then has ESG become such a hot topic? So I'm going to look at 3 key drivers for this change and this movement towards ESG. So first, we're going to look at regulation, legislation, and litigation. So in 2015, we had a really critical moment in the history of ESG. It was the last major COP, the Conference of the Parties for the United Nations, and it was COP21, and it took place in Paris. Many of you will be aware, on the back of COP21, many member nations joined the Paris Agreement, in which nations committed to reduce their environmental impact. And following that, we've seen a tsunami of regulation and legislation coming through, mainly around environmental, but also around some issues around S and G. For example, the Modern Slavery Act, which Jayne, if you want to know anything about it, Jayne is your lady to ask, because she is an expert in this area. But we saw a huge raft of legislation and regulation coming through. Some of it was mandatory and voluntary. Once you've signed up to it, you have certain obligations. For example, under the various reporting obligations are disclosure obligations, often around your environmental and climate change related impact. Now, many of you today won't be subject to those regulations and legislation. For example, it sometimes only relates to certain size of companies, or it might be your industry. So it certainly does relate to people within the financial industry. And many banks and funders will be signing up to things like the Equator Principles, the Principles of Responsible Investment. Once they signed up to those, they're going to have mandatory obligations that they have to comply with. And that means they'll need to pass those obligations down their supply chain. And there's other regulations like the EU taxonomy, whereby if you're sitting in a supply chain of somebody, you'll have to report, because they'll need to capture your data within their reporting. So it's just one to be aware of, that even if the regulation and legislation in relation to ESG doesn't directly apply to you, it may apply indirectly due to your funding requirements, due to your supply chain. And the other thing to flag on this is litigation. So we have seen a huge amount of ESG related litigation in the past 5 years. It's been an absolute tsunami of litigation coming through. Often it's been against governments for not taking their climate change obligations seriously enough. So you may have seen cases against the French government, the Dutch government, the Heathrow cases in the UK as well. Australia was held accountable for not considering the younger generation in climate change. But we're also seeing it against companies like Shell, and shareholder activism is becoming more and more common. Shareholders taking action against companies for not fulfilling their diversity statistics, for not setting sufficiently stretching ESG related targets. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Could we go to the next slide, please, Kate? So the second driver I would highlight to you as companies is the financial risk and opportunity of ESG. Now, I put a quote on this slide from a conduct cost project. This project was essentially looking at bank misconduct, and it looked at a group of 20 banks. And I'll tell you the data collection period at the end of this. But essentially, between those 20 banks, they'd paid conduct costs in excess of 377 billion. And that was on everything related to bank misconduct, whether it was fines, judgments, settlements against a bank, having to pay some of their profits out, and so on. Could also be their share value falling. So if you thought about 377 billion, that's 20 banks, that's a huge amount of money. How much would each bank be spending? What might the data collection period be? 20, 30, 40 years? Well, I wonder how surprised you'd be to hear that that data collection period was only over 10 years. And by my reckoning, that means each bank has been spending 1.9 billion on average a year on misconduct related to ESG. So it's a really salutary lesson in why we need to take ESG into account when we do things. And obviously, it's also a very extreme example. But another recent example you might have heard of is the Deliveroo IPO. So Deliveroo decided they were going to launch their initial public offering on the London Stock Exchange. And you would expect some of the major investors like Aviva, AXA, and so on to take part in that IPO. However, on the run up to it, many of the major investment houses stated they would not be taking part. And many of them stated it was ESG concerns to do with the fact that Deliveroo have an employment model using the gig economy. And for the investors to come out and publicly state ESG was a reason they're not going to invest, it's really major. And on the flip side of that, we've seen there's actually financial opportunity in relation to ESG. So companies who take part in ESG friendly activities are often more appealing to customers, to clients. People want to work with them to fulfill their own ESG obligations, and therefore can add to profit, share value. And we are seeing companies like BP, when they announce they're going to decarbonize, their share value has rocketed. We're seeing there's more access to funding. We're seeing a whole raft of opportunities in relation to ESG. So it's certainly one to consider about if you're trying to talk to your organization about why should we do ESG? Because essentially, without profit, a company is not sustainable. Could we go on to the next slide, please, Kate? And linked to your profit is your reputation. Your profit often derives directly from what other people think of you. And a good example of this is Barclays. So during the South African government period, when the South African government was involved in apartheid, Barclays were working with the South African government. Barclays have openly stated that due to their involvement, they've lost a whole generation of customers. And a more recent example, Volkswagen. When you think about Volkswagen, do you now think about reliable cars, or do you think emissions scandal? Reputation can really harm a company in the long term. And it's never been easier with the advent of social media for people to know what your company is doing and for people to destroy your reputation. And we saw during the 2020 pandemic, when you would think that actually people don't have time to be thinking about ESG and what companies are doing, it really became a major concern for many, many young people, for many movements. For example, Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg. They were really making great impacts on what companies did, their reputation. It was a really critical period in bringing the S of ESG to the fore, and also just in showing how critical it is for companies to be thinking about their ESG. And one further example that I would give under reputation is to think about the fact that it's not just people working with you, but it's people working for you. So the CEO of Unilever, Alan Jopley, has said that ESG is a major talent magnet. People not only want to work with companies that align with their values, but they want to work for companies that align with their value. So by integrating ESG into what you do internally as well, you can, and externally, you can attract great talent to your organization. You can hold on to that great talent in your organization as well. So I'm going to hand back to Neil now to talk some more about governance.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, and speaking as somebody who is an 18-year-old kid, tried to open an account with Barclays Bank and then switched. This was in the early 1980s because of the pickets outside the campus at Manchester University. It's an example that ESG has actually been going on for quite a long time. Governance. For me, governance is the one that a lot of people struggle with the most, and it's the one that's most obviously going to fall into the lap of in-house counsel in any organisation. But for me, governance is the key to making the E and the S happen. You have to, if this is going to be successful, embed ESG into the decision-making processes and the budgetary processes of any organisation to make sure that the decisions are made in the right way, taking the right things into account. So the governance structure is absolutely pivotal to making this work. And this isn't a box ticking exercise. This isn't a question of being able to say in an audit or something, yes, we have these structures in place. This is actually doing something that will lead to changes in behaviours in any organisation. So how do you go about doing that? Well, if we start with the board, if you're a company, the board of directors have the ultimate say in what happens. If you're any other kind of organisation, there'll be some kind of management committee or board running it. That's where we start. So, for instance, do we have a diversity at board level? Do we have a director who has lead responsibility? And the reason I emphasize that is because ultimately ESG won't really embed itself in an organization unless the key leaders at the top of any organization are on board with it. And also somebody has ultimate responsibility. And I say that because ESG covers such a wide range of areas, as you've heard from Carla. This covers your procurement policies, it covers your estate management of your properties, it covers HR, it covers your IT team, it covers marketing and PR and risk management in terms of your brand, and obviously compliance and risk management. And a lot of organisations place those areas in different silos within the organisation. But to get a fully integrated ESG strategy going, somebody has to have oversight of all of that. So who is that within the organisation? And starting at the top, who is the director within the board who has ultimate responsibility for ESG? Does the board set up an ESG committee? We're seeing that certainly with larger companies, actually setting up a board committee of people to make sure the strategy gets driven forward. And even things like when the board meet, is ESG built into the agenda of every meeting? And is it built into every decision-making process at board level? And if you're putting papers to the board, for instance, to get approval of a particular issue or budgetary matter, is there some kind of ESG impact assessment as part of that process? That should be built into it if your ESG strategy is going to succeed. And then the question from a strategic level and from a governance level is this risk management? And Carla's explained some of the risks if we get this wrong, or is it something more ambitious? Do we want to do more than just comply? Or do you as an organisation want to drive the ESG strategy forward? Do you want to be at the front of the bus, the middle, or the back, being pulled along by regulators? And that's a key part of your governance structure. Framing that will then enable you to frame what governance structure you need to drive it forward. And a key part in any governance structure, obviously, policies. We all have lots of policies. We all love reading them. But the big question is, are those policies actually living documents? I've spoken to an organisation who, they got to dig around for hours in virtual files to find them. Are they living documents? Are there ways in which you can make them living and breathing documents so people actually use them to guide the governance structure of the organisation and the way in which decisions are taken? So even things like making sure everybody knows where they are, making sure they're written in plain English, providing speed read summaries so people can have a quick glance through and get to understand what they are, engaging with staff and asking them what they think of the policies and where they can be improved. They're the people who probably know the most. And staff training, rather than just make them read the policies, how about running training sessions in which people learn what those policies are designed to achieve, or what, if it's a risk area, what they're designed to mitigate in terms of risk. That way you get more buy-in from your people and those policies become living documents as part of your governance structure. If you're a multinational organisation, well, you've got the additional issue about the fact that different jurisdictions in different parts of the world just have differing views on what is good governance and what is not, and that's a really difficult issue to balance in multinational organisations. Whose standards do you observe? The highest or the not so? Carla's talked about reputational risk of getting this wrong. There is obviously a huge reputational risk in getting this wrong, but it can also be career limiting. So if you're an in-house counsel being asked by the board to drive this forward, understand there has been some pretty high profile examples of senior partners of big multinational organizations, key executive directors of big multinational companies whose careers have suffered badly because they got this wrong. So when you're putting your governance structure in place, one of the reasons you're putting it in there is to make sure the governance stop those things happening. Okay, so at that, I'll hand you back to Carla, who's going to talk about the very topical drive for net zero.
Thank you very much, Neil. So net zero is highly topical, and it's really great to be talking to you right now when COP26 is taking place, because it could not be more topical. So net zero is essentially the point at which an organisation or a government or any sort of body's emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions are no greater than the emissions they're removing from the atmosphere. So you reach essentially a balance of net zero. So the UK government has set in law, there is a target to reach net zero by 2050. We're hoping to see some really ambitious things coming out of COP26. I'm not going to say a huge amount about net zero today, just because I think it would be foolish to try and preempt what might be said. But just to kind of explain how it works with organizations, how do you get to net zero? What do you do? So there are three things that you generally do if you're trying to reach net zero as an organization. Your organization may already have set some targets, or you may be in the process of thinking, how do we set some? So once you've decided you're going to reach net zero, the first thing to evaluate, to measure where are you? Because you can't try and get to net zero unless you know exactly where you are right now. And you measure across three what are called scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Now, your Scope 1 emissions are things that you do as an organization directly. So anything that's going on while you're in the organization, all the sort of emissions you're producing while you're working in the company's building, etc. Your Scope 2 emissions are those that you're indirectly responsible for. So your electricity you're buying in, those sorts of things. And your Scope 3 emissions are the really challenging ones. So Scope 3 emissions are ones that people don't often report on because they're so difficult to, but we need to think about them if we're going to get to net zero. Your Scope 3 emissions are those things you are not responsible for. So for example, the emissions of your supply chain. Now, how do you control what your delivery drivers do? How do you control what happens when clients leave your building and drive home? You don't have control over that. There are certain things you can do in terms of putting clauses into contracts for your suppliers, and the Chancery Lane project's a really good place to start looking at kind of precedent clauses. Obviously, please do get legal advice if you're going to embed any of that into your contract, because they are just precedent and not adapted to the circumstances, but they'll give you some ideas. But once you've worked out your Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, then it's up to you to reduce those. And there's lots and lots of ways of doing that. And I'm sure you're all seeing many, many tips and advice on how you can reduce. And it can be as simple as saying to people, please print less, to something more challenging of, we're going to change the way we produce energy. We're going to become self-sufficient, or we're going to buy from a more sustainable energy producer. And the last resort, and I emphasize it should always be a last resort, is to then offset. And offsetting is essentially buying carbon credits to offset any remaining emissions. It should be a last resort because it is not the way that we really should be reaching net zero, but we recognize that it is going to be virtually impossible to reach net zero without it. For example, looking at those emissions you don't have control over. So those are the three ways in which we try and reach net zero. And we are in a climate emergency, so it's essential that we do something now to do it. We've seen the forest fires in the United States. We've seen the floods we had in Europe over this summer. So it is critical that we do something and we start moving towards net zero, especially if we're going to reach 2050. It's already a challenging target. If you are interested in finding out more about net zero, we do quite a lot of work here at Mills & Reeve. We've done a thought leadership piece, which is the image on the screen, which was a report I worked on with Professor Sean Smith from the University of Edinburgh. And we do have another seminar coming up later this month on net zero post COP26. There's also organizations like Lawyers for Net Zero, which is an in-house organization, which is an organization for in-house counsel like yourselves, talking about how we reach net zero. But there's lots of information about there. The important thing, as with anything in ESG, is to do something rather than nothing. And I'm now going to hand back to Neil to talk about funding.
Thanks, Carla. Okay, I'll keep this brief as we're kind of heading towards the time limit. But if you think about how ESG has really taken off in the last 10, 15 years, it was in the world of investment circles where it really has become a huge issue earlier than maybe it has in other sectors. So we see fund managers and major investors looking more and more and more at the ESG credentials of the businesses they're investing in. We see banks looking more and more at the ESG credentials of the businesses and organizations that they're lending to. So ESG for any organization is becoming increasingly a key component in how and whether they can go about raising funding. So ESG rating of investment funds mean that those investment funds themselves want to invest in businesses and organizations with good ESG credentials. And remember, they're doing that for two reasons. First, because their own investors are putting pressure on them. The bank's shareholders are putting pressure on banks to use their power as investors to improve behaviors in the organizations they fund. But secondly, there is a growing recognition that if a business is more sustainable or compliant from an ESG perspective, it is also going to be more sustainable in the medium long term from a financial perspective. And in fact, McKinsey did a recent survey of C-suite leaders that something like over 80% of them basically said ESG programs are going to contribute more shareholder value over the next 5 years. So ESG, not only is it the right thing to do, but it also goes to the heart of your ability to raise funding in the medium and longer term. And we're seeing a proliferation of ESG funds. We're seeing a proliferation of sustainability funds. We're seeing banks putting a huge emphasis on green financing structures. We're seeing the government, even in the last couple of weeks, setting out its roadmap for a green financial system in the UK to put a huge emphasis on environmental credentials in funding. So if your organisation is looking to raise funding in a short or medium term, you really need to think about where you are on your ESG journey, because what is going to happen is, whether it's a lender or an investor, is they are going to start looking at your ESG credentials. And the better track record you've got, quite bluntly, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to raise the funding, or you're going to be able to raise funding on better terms. So we're seeing lenders who will not only look at your ESG criteria, whether you meet their ESG criteria, but they feed that back into, is your business sustainable? And by that they mean, are you a good credit risk? It is now one of the things that is being taken into account by banks in their credit ratings of organisations. We're also seeing some pretty innovative stuff around the cost of finance. In other words, it could be cheaper to borrow if you have a really strong ESG strategy and you are implementing it and you are meeting key targets. And we're seeing financing structures from banks which have ESG targets, ESG covenants within it. And if those are met, the coupon stays low. If they're not met, then the interest rate goes up. And also, we've been hearing some interesting stuff from banks around the direction of travel of this. So in other words, whilst you may be okay now because there isn't enough of a driver to not finance you at the moment because of your ESG strategy, because as we know from the survey we did at the start, a lot of people are very early on in their journey. In 3 to 5 years' time, investors and lenders are going to be expecting organizations to be further on in that journey. So if you're looking at raising funding now, yeah, probably going to be okay, and making commitments to develop your strategy. In 3 to 5 years' time, when you look at refinancing the debt facilities you've taken on, are you going to be good enough to get that refinancing? And a real key component of this is also not just developing the strategy and starting to do it, but measuring and reporting. Because we're seeing organizations now carrying out more and more detailed due diligence, ESG audits. And when they do this due diligence or audit, they're asking for evidence to back up what you say. So not only do you need a system of your ESG strategy to be developed, your governance structure put in place, but measuring it and reporting it and making sure that you have the evidence to back it up as and when somebody does an audit or a due diligence exercise on you is absolutely key to a fundraising. So at that, I'll hand you back to Carla to finish off with some tips.
Thanks, Neil. So our initial question to you today was, where do you think you are in that ESG journey? And as Neil said, about 50% of you are in the very early stages. But the fact you've come here today, that's brilliant, because that is step one. You've started your ESG journey. And some of you are further on in that journey. You also come from a range of organizations. So I've tried to come up with a couple of key tips on how to get that journey started. And as Neil said, he loves an acronym. So I've done mine under E, S, and G to make it easy to remember. So first step, as Neil said, reporting, measuring, evaluate. Work out where you are and work out what you're doing internally and as well as externally. So what do you say publicly, and also what do you do in terms of your diversity, in terms of how you incentivize your staff, etc. And it could be as simple as talking to your facilities team. What energy do we use? What's happening in your cafeteria? Are you using glass bottles? Are you using plastics? So evaluate your situation. S is for set targets. Once you know where you are, try and work out what's the next step. If you have some targets, it's always going to be easier to move people towards that. Also, try and find those low-hanging fruit that you can tick off. So you can go, okay, we've done that, fantastic. We're kind of making progress. It's easier to buy people in. And also look for things you don't need a huge amount of resource to do and things you can make easy, simple changes with. And of course, it's fantastic to have those bigger targets like net zero, but make sure you've got ones that are within your capabilities, but are also stretching. And finally, the G in ESG for two things. First, greenwashing. As Neil said, don't do it. Greenwashing is essentially saying something but not doing it. So if you said you were the most sustainable organization in the UK and you were almost at net zero, are you genuinely there? Because you'll be found out, and reputationally, it's a disaster. And the G is also for groups. Find other people you can share knowledge and information with. Nobody can do this alone. We need to work together to do it. So groups like Lawyers for Net Zero, or internal groups of people working towards sustainability in your organization at board level. ESG needs to run through every fibre of your organization if it's going to work. So find those groups of people who are passionate and excited and want to make a difference internally, and find those groups outside. People who come to seminars, people who go to sustainability organizations, who you can share knowledge with, you can get tips from, and you can work together towards ESG, because none of us can do it on our own. And that's what's so brilliant about something like COP26. So with that, I think I'm handing back to Jayne to open for questions.
Thank you, Carla. Thanks. Thank you, Neil. Question from me, actually, Carla, is you mentioned the Chancery Lane project, which might be worth explaining a little bit more about that to the audience.
Of course. Yeah, so the Chancery Lane project is a really interesting project. It's mainly under the environmental aspects, but it's essentially a group of lawyers who've come together from all sorts of organizations, from law firms, independent solicitors, barristers, and so on, to create a raft of precedent clauses that people can use in contracts to make them essentially greener. And they range from everything for, like I was saying earlier, from trying to encourage your suppliers to be more green, to cascading net zero obligations down your supply chain. And they're all named after children, because the idea is this is the future of basically the future generations. And it's something that if anybody is interested in joining, they can just go and speak to Chancery Lane Project and join up, or you can equally find some draft precedents to use there if you're looking for ways to make sure your contracts incorporate some ESG friendly obligations.
Thank you, because I think that, I mean, you quite rightly say they need to be tailored and thought about for each circumstance, but it's quite interesting from my perspective, from sort of supply chain contracting, that you're seeing more and more of those sorts of clauses and obligations being flowed down. And I think there is a risk in that quite often they are appearing at the back of a contract. And quite often people just view that as a bit of boilerplate. So when you sort of test people and say, actually, can you really commit to this? Quite often what you find is people can't, and they don't. That then forces them to have a strategy, because they fundamentally they have the risk of losing business. And we're seeing it a lot more as well on tenders, where we're helping our clients sort of risk assess on tender responses, and the amount of sort of ESG criteria that are now appearing in tender responses. And I mean, certainly we are also seeing that as a firm when we are asked to submit tenders. So that's sort of a very direct business impact flow through.
Absolutely. And I think the emissions thing I was talking about earlier with scope 3 emissions, it would be very easy to just stick them in a contract and go, you must report on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, but not really understand. But scope 3 emissions are virtually impossible to report on. Yeah. So you need to make sure that what you're doing is actually A, realistic, like you said, Jayne, and B, it's not just shoved at the back of a contract, it's actually at the forefront of your mind, because the last thing you want to do is find yourself caught out on this.
Yeah. Exactly. The other interesting point, which we haven't touched on, well, you mentioned it, is the sort of ethical labour. So, of course, there's the modern slavery reporting obligations that bite on anybody with turnover of 36 million or above. But again, what we are seeing is that is actually flowing further down the supply chain. But again, I think there's a very interesting point there, as to not viewing that, ensuring your organisation doesn't view that as a tick box exercise, that actually they do embed ethical labour and the right and proper treatment of labour.
100%. It's so vital, and anyone who's been, it happens in retail from time to time that retailers, through no fault of their own, discover that somewhere in their supply chain there's use of unethical labour, and it's reputationally terrible for them, and they may have done everything they could to try and prevent that. Companies who are really on it can get caught out. So it must be part of your DNA, essentially.
Yeah, well, we saw that last year with Boohoo, didn't we, actually?
Oh, goodness, yes, we absolutely did.
Now, we've had a question come in around, has there been other guidance published around UK taxonomies assessing how green turnover is? That might be one more for you, Neil.
Not a great deal, sadly. I mean, we've got the government roadmap around green financing, which actually is talking about some pretty stringent disclosure requirements for larger organisations, and is particularly looking at, in terms of its roadmap, around trying to stop greenwashing. Because it's recognising this is becoming an increasing issue. You know, if you look at an investment fund that holds itself out as sustainable, and then if you dive into the underlying investments that make up that portfolio, you'd be quite surprised sometimes that it's actually got the label of a green fund. So I think that's probably the biggest area of movement at the moment, because as always, change really happens when legislation or regulation drives it. And I think that's going to the forcing of disclosure, the forcing kind of developing of policies which are designed to stop greenwashing, to make it unacceptable to be seen to be greenwashing. I think over the next 2 to 3 years, if they're implemented, will be a key step forward, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And we've had somebody ask us to talk through the Boohoo example. So I think I'll probably kick off with that, Carla, and then you'll be able to supplement my comments. So this emerged, actually, I think it was during lockdown 1, where it was discovered that workers in factories supplying Boohoo around actually the Leicester conurbation and a bit wider the East Midlands conurbation were working in very, very poor conditions. There wasn't social distancing. There wasn't any sort of care or safety for those workers' welfare. There were questions about their pay rates, where the way they were working actually meant that they were working under minimum wage levels. There were a raft of health and safety issues. So this got picked up by the press, and the story ran and ran and ran, and Boohoo ended up appointing a QC to do a full review of their supply chain, and the labour relations in their supply chain. If my memory serves me correctly, what was the fundamental conclusion of that report was that ethical labour considerations were completely missing at a senior level in Boohoo. They had not embedded any consideration of ethical labour practices in their supply chain and in their dealings with their supply chain. So it made quite grim reading, actually, because it goes back to the point that Neil was making around governance, that it has to start at the top. And what was identified through that report was that it certainly was not starting at the top. Carl, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Jayne said, it wasn't taken into consideration, but it's been in the press before that Leicester had issues. Yeah. Harriet Harman did a report on Leicester and the problems with the working conditions there. So actually, that board should have been aware that Leicester, it was a risk, but nothing was done. And reputationally, it's been terrible. We saw the Boohoo share value plummet when it came out. It did increase again, which has totally shocked me. But on the run up to that, Boohoo were considered to be a really ESG friendly fund. And obviously they were not. And I think I would just say on as well that it just shows how easy it is, if you greenwash something, for your reputation to be quite badly damaged at the end of it. The US are saying, I'm not sure where they got to now, but they were suggesting they would ban Boohoo from importing because of these allegations. And the fact they had to have an investigation, they had to look at it. It's it's not a small thing. So ESG needs to come from the top. It needs to be taken into consideration. If it's not, Boohoo's just a great example of how ESG can impact your business very severely.
It's quite interesting actually, because there are apps now where you can put a retailer's name into it, and there will be an ESG scoring. Now, how accurate those apps are, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the point is, you know, it is another vehicle for people to check the credentials of who they're buying from, and it is another vehicle for people to raise concerns about an organisation. So again, this comes to your point, Carla, around reputation, really.
Yeah, and there's companies like Share Action who put pressure. They buy shares in companies to put pressure to try and improve their practices and the way they operate. And on the run up to the Deliveroo IPO, they got various people from Deliveroo to talk about their experiences working for the company. And that's the thing with social media, you might think your workers are in the factory, etc., but they can talk about it quite easily. There is no way that you're going to stop that coming out now. And you shouldn't be trying to stop it coming out, because it should not exist. So reputationally, it's just something to be aware of, and hopefully there's very few bad practices we're going to have to uncover coming forward, but inevitably there will be some.
Somebody has just asked me about the apps that I mentioned. They're actually, I've got one on my personal phone which is in the other room, so if you drop me an email afterwards, I will give you a list of the names of the apps. So that's just to confirm to that person who asked me that question. So we are approaching 10 to 11. So I think that's been a really great informative session. Thank you again, Carla and Neil. Thank you all for attending and participating. Thank you and have a good day.